Come closer. You can sit right here on the edge of the velvet chair. Just let the heavy fabric sink beneath you. Listen. Just listen for a moment. Do you hear that? The slow, rhythmic drumming against the window pane. The rain has been falling for hours, washing away the footprints on the street outside, wrapping this house in a thick, protective blanket of sound. It is perfectly safe here. It is just you and me, and the deep, velvet dark. I asked you to sit with me tonight because the silence was growing too heavy to carry alone. Some secrets are like that. They sit in the center of your chest, quiet and cold, pressing against your ribs until it hurts to draw a full breath. I have carried this one for a very long time. I need to tell you a truth that still keeps me awake at night. Take a deep breath with me. Draw the air in slowly. Let the scent of the room settle over you. Can you smell the melting wax from the amber candle on the table? The faint, dry dust of old paper from the books lining the walls? The fire died down to embers an hour ago, leaving a soft, orange glow that dances across the floorboards. Every now and then, the old wood groans. A gentle, settling sound. It is a comforting noise. It reminds me that even houses need to shift their weight, to breathe, to find their balance in the middle of the night. But I spent most of my life not allowed to shift my weight. I was not allowed to breathe. I come from a world of glass. That is the best way I can describe it. A pristine, polished world where everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly lit, and utterly fragile. To the outside world, my family was a masterpiece. We were the portrait of success framed in gold. We spoke with steady, measured voices. We wore smiles that looked beautiful in photographs. We were admired. We were envied. But you know what happens to things kept inside a glass case, don't you? They become untouchable. They gather dust. They suffocate. I was the only one who felt the lack of air. For years, I believed that if I just made myself smaller, I could survive the display. I folded away the brightest parts of myself. I quieted my laughter. I sanded down the edges of my personality until I was smooth and unremarkable, just hoping I could blend into the background of their perfection. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The people who are supposed to protect you, the people who are supposed to be your sanctuary, can sometimes be the ones holding the lock and key to your cage. I never told anyone what it actually felt like to sit at that grand dining table. The clinking of crystal glasses, the soft scrape of silver forks against fine china, the low, polite hum of conversation. It sounded so refined, but underneath it, there was a quiet, suffocating pressure. Every word they spoke to me was wrapped in a soft layer of disappointment, a subtle tilt of the head, a patronizing chuckle. They didn't have to raise their voices to hurt me deeply. They used whispers. They used shadows. They used a type of casual dismissal that felt like ice water dripping slowly, endlessly, onto my skin. You start to believe the cold is normal. You start to think that shivering is just a part of who you are. Until one night, the cold becomes too much. I need you to understand that what I did was considered the ultimate betrayal. In my family, loyalty was not earned through love. It was a strict, unspoken contract. You showed up, you played your part, and you never, ever broke the illusion. But I broke it. I did the unthinkable. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't shatter the glass case with a heavy stone. I just found the latch, opened the door, and stepped out into the night. Look at my hands. Watch how still they are now in the dim light of the candle. They used to tremble all the time, a constant, nervous vibration humming beneath my skin. The fear of being looked at, the fear of being judged, the fear of taking up too much space. That fear is gone now, but the memory of it still echoes in my bones. I want to tell you how it happened. I want to walk you through the long, quiet corridors of that life, down into the shadows of what it really meant to wear their name. I want to tell you about the subtle red flags, the creeping doubts, and the singular, silent moment where I realized I could either disappear completely or I could leave. Rest your head back. Close your eyes if you want to. Let my voice lower to a whisper. Let the sound of the rain anchor you to this room. I am going to tell you everything. Listen to the rain again. It is coming down a little harder now, tapping against the glass. It makes the world outside feel so distant, doesn't it? Just shadows and blurred streetlights. I want you to think about glass for a moment. It is clear. It is elegant. It protects what is inside. But it is also rigid. If you press against it too hard, it shatters. And if you are trapped inside it, the air slowly runs out, quietly and invisibly, while everyone on the outside admires how perfectly preserved you look. That was my childhood. Growing up, carrying the Harrington name meant you were expected to live inside that immaculate display. The house I grew up in was beautiful in a breathless, intimidating sort of way. It always smelled of lemon polish, fresh lilies, and cold marble. Even in the dead of summer, there was a chill in the air, the kind of chill that settles into the heavy drapery and the flawless hardwood floors. You could walk down the grand hallway and hear nothing but the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Tick, tick, tick. It was a constant, heavy reminder that time was passing, and you were expected to mold yourself into something impressive, something they could boast about softly over crystal glasses of champagne. My older brother, Marcus, understood the rhythm perfectly. He polished his side of the glass case with a surgeon's steady hands. Everything about him was precise. I remember the crisp, stiff sound of his textbooks turning late into the night, the heavy, authoritative click of his expensive pens. He never faltered. He was exactly what a Harrington was supposed to be. And then there was my sister, Claire. Claire placed her life on a pedestal of silk and status. Her world sounded like the sharp, rhythmic tap of designer heels on polished floors, the soft, breezy rustle of country club invitations. She spoke in sentences that always ended in a soft, knowing laugh, a laugh that made you feel like you were not quite in on the joke. They were the masterpieces of the family. And me, I was the smudge on the glass. They never shouted it. They never had to. Disappointment in my family was not delivered with loud arguments or slamming doors. It was an art form. It was a subtle, suffocating shadow that crept into the room the moment I entered. They would introduce me at their elegant dinners, their voices dropping just half an octave. They would tilt their heads, offering a smile that hovered on their lips but never quite reached their eyes. "This is Avery," they would say, their tone laced with a delicate, heavy pity. "She is creative." They said the word creative as if it were a polite synonym for a tragic flaw, as if I were a delicate, lost thing that hadn't quite figured out how the real world worked. It didn't matter that I spent my days covered in charcoal dust and linseed oil, building a design studio from the ground up. It didn't matter that I poured my soul into every canvas, every spatial concept, every room I brought to life. To them, it was just a hobby, a phase, a quaint little distraction until I found my actual lane. I thought love was a currency. I truly believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved how deeply I cared, I could earn my place on their pedestal. I remember the smell of fresh eucalyptus and damp earth. I spent 3 weeks building a massive, intricate floral arch for Claire's engagement party. My hands were blistered, my fingernails stained dark with sap and soil. I wove every stem by hand, trying to build a physical manifestation of my love for her. When she saw it, she gently touched one of the white roses. She gave that soft, hollow laugh. "It is so quirky, Avery," she murmured. Quirky. The word landed heavy and cold on my chest. Later that year, I painted a watercolor sketch for Marcus's new nursery. I remember the soft, wet scrape of the brush against the thick cotton paper, the way the golden and blue pigments bled together, creating a landscape that felt safe, warm, and tender. I handed it to him in the quiet of his pristine living room. He took it by the very edges, holding it away from himself as if the paint might stain his immaculate suit. He offered a polite, close-mouthed smile. He reminded me, with a soft pat on my shoulder, that they had already hired a real decorator. He set the painting face down on the marble counter. I didn't get angry. I didn't cry. I just stood there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, feeling a deep, hollow ache spread through my ribs. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I nodded. I sanded down another piece of my spirit, sweeping the dust under the rug, hoping that maybe next time I would finally be enough. But each soft chuckle, each gentle dismissal, was stacking up in the dark, a heavy, invisible weight pressing against the glass. And the glass was beginning to strain. Watch the candle flame for a moment. Notice how it dips and sways when a draft finds its way into the room. It fights so hard to stay tall, to keep burning bright, even when the cold air tries to push it down. For the longest time, that was exactly how I felt. The holidays were always the heaviest times in the Harrington house. The air grew thicker then. The expectations piled up like heavy, unyielding snowdrifts against the windows. If you have never been an outsider in your own family, it is hard to explain the specific, quiet dread that settles in your stomach when the calendar turns to November. It is a slow, creeping shadow, a tightening in the throat. Let me tell you about Thanksgiving. I wanted so desperately to bring something warm into the house. I spent 2 entire days in my small kitchen, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and roasting apples. I baked pies entirely from scratch, rolling out the dough by hand, fluting the edges with careful, deliberate precision. I wanted them to taste the care I had poured into them. I wanted them to take a single bite and finally look at me with genuine warmth. I carried those pies into their sprawling, immaculate dining room. I set them down on the pristine linen tablecloth. My father looked at the rustic, golden crusts. He didn't say a word at first. He just let out a slow, quiet breath. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Then came the soft, patronizing jab disguised as a joke. A remark about how I always found time for domestic hobbies instead of building a real portfolio. The warmth of the kitchen washed away in an instant. I sat in my seat, staring down at my perfectly folded napkin, listening to the soft, silver clink of forks against porcelain. The pie tasted like ash in my mouth. Then came Christmas. The house was draped in heavy velvet ribbons and glittering garlands. The fire crackled in the massive hearth, but the heat never seemed to reach my chair. I sat in the corner of the velvet sofa, my hands wrapped tightly around a warm mug, just trying to anchor myself. I listened to the rhythmic, confident cadence of my siblings' voices. Marcus and Claire leaned against the marble island in the kitchen, casually boasting about their rising salaries and the square footage of their new, immaculate houses. Every word they spoke was a brick being laid in a wall between us. When they finally turned to me, the tone shifted. The air grew thin. Claire tilted her head, her heavy diamond earrings catching the firelight. She offered that familiar, sympathetic smile. "And how are you, Avery?" she asked, her voice dropping to that soft, delicate whisper. "Are you still doing that fun stuff?" That fun stuff. The design studio I was bleeding for. The business I was building with my own two hands. The late nights, the graphite stains on my fingers, the spaces I was bringing to life. To them, it was just a child's game, a temporary distraction. I nodded slowly. I smiled. I took a slow sip from my mug to hide the way my bottom lip was trembling. But the deepest shadow, the one that finally began to eclipse the light, fell over the table during Easter. The dining room was flooded with pale spring sunlight. The table was set with flawless crystal and polished silver. Every setting had an elegant, heavy cardstock name card resting gracefully on the center of the plate. I walked around the long table, my hand trailing lightly over the backs of the heavy mahogany chairs. I looked for my name. Marcus, Claire, my father, my mother. I reached the end of the table. My beautiful, embossed name card was missing. In its place, resting on the fine china, was a torn, jagged scrap of paper. My name had been scribbled across it hastily in dark marker ink. It was a last-minute thought, an afterthought, a physical manifestation of my place in their world. Claire walked into the room, adjusting her silk blouse. She saw me staring at the torn paper. She let out a bright, airy laugh. "Oh, don't mind that," she said lightly. "We just call this your arts and crafts place." I pulled the chair out. It groaned against the floorboards. When I sat down, the chair wobbled beneath me. It was uneven, unsteady, just like my footing in that family. I didn't push the chair back. I didn't demand a real name card. I let out a soft, hollow laugh. I laughed along with her, because that is exactly what I had been trained to do. I had been conditioned to swallow the disrespect, to digest the subtle cruelties, to pretend that the cold rain didn't chill me to the bone. I sat in that wobbly chair, staring at the torn scrap of paper, and I felt the walls of the glass case pressing tightly against my skin. The air was running out, and I knew deep in the quietest part of my soul that I could not survive in that room much longer. Have you ever lay in the dark, entirely still, just listening to the sound of your own heartbeat? It can be a deafening sound when the rest of the world is quiet. Thump, thump, thump. A steady, relentless reminder that you are alive, even when you feel like a ghost in your own life. After that Easter dinner, the creeping doubt didn't just visit me. It moved in. It unpacked its bags in the quiet, shadowed corners of my mind. I would lie awake at night, staring at the pale moonlight stretching across my bedroom ceiling. I would replay every conversation, every slight, every hollow smile. I would pull the heavy cotton sheets up to my chin, feeling a deep, vibrating chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I asked myself the same questions over and over until they became a dull ache behind my eyes. Why couldn't I just be what they wanted? Why was it so hard for me to fit into their frame? I was an artist. I understood how a frame worked. It was designed to contain a picture, to define its edges, to make it presentable for the world to see. But I was spilling over the edges. My colors were too bright. My lines were too wild. So I tried to fix myself. I didn't get angry at first. I thought my anger would only prove them right. I thought it would just be another chaotic, unpredictable emotion that made me the eccentric Harrington child. Instead, I simply dulled myself. Imagine taking a rough, beautifully textured stone and rubbing it against heavy sandpaper. Back and forth, over and over. You feel the dust falling away. You feel the unique grooves disappearing. You keep rubbing until the stone is perfectly round, perfectly smooth, and perfectly devoid of character. That is what I did to my own soul. I began sanding down the edges of my passion. When I visited them, I stopped talking about the design projects I poured my soul into. I stopped mentioning the murals I painted on community center walls. I locked that vibrant part of me away, leaving it in my studio alongside my graphite pencils and drafting paper. I thought if I made myself less vibrant, the shadows they cast wouldn't look so dark. But it didn't work. The human spirit is not meant to be contained in a breathless vacuum. Each soft chuckle from Marcus, each sideways glance from Claire, each subtle, cutting jab from my father, disguised so cleverly as humor. They were not isolated moments. They were cumulative. As a visual artist, I knew how a painting came to life. It happens just one gentle stroke at a time. But these moments, these quiet rejections, they stacked like brushstrokes on a canvas that eventually suffocated, layer upon heavy layer, dark grays and bruised purples painted over my bright yellows and warm blues. The canvas of my life was becoming incredibly heavy. It was becoming completely opaque. The original image of who I was supposed to be was completely lost beneath the weight of their paint. I felt a physical heaviness in my chest, a constant, tight knot right beneath my ribs. Have you ever held your breath, hoping you won't be noticed? Imagine holding it for years. That was my doubt. It was the terrifying, silent realization that I was participating in my own erasure. I was holding the sandpaper. I was handing them the brushes. I was letting them paint over me. But the turning point was approaching. The air in the house was growing impossibly thin. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was looming on the calendar. It was supposed to be a grand event, a sweeping celebration of endurance, of status, of the flawless Harrington image. I wanted to belong so deeply. I still held on to that fragile, desperate hope that if I could just present myself perfectly, if I could just give them something beautiful, the glass case would open, and they would invite me inside to stand beside them. I spent weeks preparing for that night. I didn't buy a dress from a designer boutique like Claire would have. I wanted to wear something that carried a piece of me. I bought yards of silk in a soft, dusky rose. I spent my evenings sitting by the window in my apartment, the soft yellow light of a lamp spilling over my lap. I stitched that dress myself. Every seam, every hem, every delicate fold. The needle pulling through the silk made a quiet, whispering sound, like a secret being kept, like a promise being made. I poured all my longing, all my silent apologies for not being who they wanted, into that fabric. I tried to believe, if only for one night, that things might be different. I tried to believe that when they looked at me, standing there in a dress made by my own hands, they would finally see me. I didn't know yet that the fabric I was weaving was not a dress for a celebration. It was armor for a quiet revolution. The rain is slowing down now. Can you hear the difference? It has turned into a soft, steady mist against the glass. I want to take you to that night, the night the heavy glass case finally broke. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The venue was dripping with elegance. Glittering fairy lights were strung across the high ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. The tables were draped in heavy white linen. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light, sparkling like ice. I wore the dusky rose dress I had stitched myself. I remember the way the silk felt against my skin. It was cool, soft, and remarkably heavy. I ran my fingers over the invisible seams I had sewn late into the night. It felt like a layer of protection. It felt like a quiet declaration that I belonged there, in my own way. The evening hummed with the sound of polite, wealthy conversation, the soft scrape of silverware, the low, melodic notes of a string quartet playing in the corner. I sat at the grand table, my hands folded perfectly to my lap. I watched my family. I watched my father holding court, his chest puffed out in a tailored tuxedo. I watched Marcus swirling amber liquid in a lowball glass. I watched Claire leaning in to whisper something to a cousin, her perfect laugh carrying over the music. A quiet hope fluttered in my chest, a dangerous, fragile thing. I wanted to honor them. I wanted to offer something beautiful, something true. So I reached for my silver spoon. I tapped it gently against the side of my crystal glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound cut through the low hum of the room. Heads turned. The conversation slowed, then rippled to a halt. The string quartet faded into silence. I stood up. The silk of my dress rustled softly as I rose. I felt 100 pairs of eyes resting heavily upon me. My hands felt cold, but my posture was straight. I held my glass up, the golden liquid catching the fairy lights. I took a breath. I opened my mouth to speak. I had prepared a few words, a tender reflection on family and time. I didn't even finish my first sentence. My father leaned back in his heavy oak chair. He swirled the wine in his glass, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. A familiar, sharp smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. Before I could form the next word, he raised his hand. He cut me off mid-sentence. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a quiet, crushing authority that easily carried across the silent room. He made a joke about sparing the room my poetry. He delivered it so casually, as if swatting away a fly, as if turning off a radio playing an irritating song. For a single second, the room was suspended in complete silence. Then the laughter came. It wasn't a roar. It was worse. It was a polite, unified ripple of amusement from aunts, cousins, and family friends. That laughter felt physical. It felt exactly like glass shattering across my skin. Thousands of tiny, invisible shards raining down on me, cutting into the dusky rose silk, settling deep into my chest. I stopped breathing. The blood rushed to my face, my cheeks burning with a heat that felt like a fever. I slowly lowered my glass. The crystal felt incredibly heavy. I sat down in silence. I stared straight ahead at the white linen tablecloth. I listened to the conversation smoothly resume around me, washing over me as if I were not even there, as if I were entirely invisible. And in that deafening, suffocating silence, a profound clarity washed over me. It was a silent realization, a quiet, heavy truth dropping like a stone into a still pond. I realized I had a choice. I realized I could spend the rest of my entire life sitting in this chair, sanding myself down, asking to be seen. I could spend my life begging for a single scrap of their approval. Or I could leave. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a sudden, vast emptiness that quickly filled with a very calm, very cold resolve. I didn't say a word. I rose again, moving with a deliberate, haunting slowness. I reached out. I picked up my small evening clutch from the table. I turned my back on the crystal, the silver, and the heavy, expectant faces. I walked straight out under the glittering fairy lights. The heels of my shoes clicked softly, rhythmically against the polished floor. A steady, even tempo. No one called my name. No one followed. No one stopped me. I reached the heavy wooden doors at the entrance. I pushed them open and stepped out into the cool, dark night. The heavy air of the ballroom was gone. The crisp, clean scent of damp earth and pine needles rushed into my lungs. I took a deep, trembling breath, and for the very first time in my entire life, leaving didn't feel like shame. It felt like revolution. Let the quiet settle around us for a moment. Listen to the stillness of this room. The rain has slowed to a faint, rhythmic whisper against the glass. The fire has burned down to soft, glowing embers. I want to lean in close now. I want to tell you the heaviest part of my secret. Most people believe that when a family breaks, there's a grand explosion, a shouting match that shakes the foundation of the house, a dramatic exit filled with harsh words and slammed doors. But that is not how my story goes. After that night, I didn't announce my departure. I didn't write a long, emotional letter. I didn't demand an apology or an explanation. I simply stopped showing up. It is a terrifyingly powerful thing to just vanish. To pack your bags in the dead of night, leaving only empty hangars and undisturbed dust. The seasons began to change. The leaves outside their grand windows turned from bright green to deep, burning amber. Thanksgiving passed without me. The winter frost settled in. Christmas, too, came and went. All their grand traditions kept moving forward like a perfectly synchronized clock. Birthdays, recitals, and galas, they all continued without my presence. I imagined them sitting at that long, immaculate table, passing the silver platters, waiting for me to walk through the door and take my wobbly seat. But the seat remained empty. At first, the texts came. Short, cautious little messages lighting up my phone screen in the dark. "Are you okay?" I would stare at the glowing letters, my thumb hovering over the glass screen. But I never typed a response. I let the screen fade to black. When my silence stretched on, their tone began to shift. The polite concern gave way to the sharp edge of their true nature. Then came the sarcasm. "Too busy for family now." I read those words, feeling the familiar, icy sting. But this time, I was out of their reach. The glass case could no longer contain me. And then, eventually, nothing. Complete, absolute silence. Here is the dark truth I promised you. The heavy realization that I uncovered in the depths of that silence. They didn't push me away because I was flawed. They pushed me away because I was deeply, unapologetically real. Their entire world was a carefully constructed illusion, a theater set made of polished marble and expensive silk. They needed me to be the failure, They needed me to be the quiet, eccentric disappointment so they could stand taller in comparison. My shadows were the only things that made their artificial light look bright. By walking away, I didn't just leave their house. I broke their mirror. In the silence they left behind, I finally began to hear myself again. I packed my life into a few boxes. I drove away from the polished streets and the manicured lawns. I moved across the state to a coastal town where absolutely no one knew the Harrington name. The air there was different. It tasted like sea salt, damp pine, and untethered freedom. I found a quiet place to hide away and rebuild. I rented a loft above a florist's shop. I want you to imagine the smell of that loft. The scent of fresh jasmine, wet earth, and crushed rose petals drifted up through the wooden floorboards every single morning. It was a heavy, intoxicating perfume that smelled like life-taking root. The floors creaked softly when I walked. The walls were bare. The space was small, but it was entirely mine. I took on small projects. Nothing grand, just honest, quiet work that felt right in my hands. I let my mornings unfold quietly with coffee in one hand and pencils in the other. I would sit by the large, arched window, watching the coastal fog roll in from the ocean. I would listen to the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The warmth of the ceramic mug seeped into my palms. The satisfying scratch of graphite against thick paper filled the quiet room. I was no longer painting to earn love. I was drawing simply because I wanted to see beautiful things exist in the world. It felt strange at first, living without the constant hum of their judgment, but slowly it became truth. I was laying down a new foundation, brick by brick, line by line. I was building a fortress out of everything they had thrown away. Breathe in the cool air with me. Imagine the scent of cedar and damp earth. Imagine a two-story home tucked away among tall, ancient pine trees with glass walls catching the morning fog. That is where my story took root. An architecture studio in Oregon had seen photos of a sunroom I designed. They asked me to lead the spatial concept for a wellness retreat. I poured everything into it, designing every corner with breathability and belonging in mind. When it was finished, a magazine ran a feature on my work titled Nature Reimagined. For the very first time, it was my name in print. Not Marcus, not Claire, not my father, just Avery. The success gave me the stability to stop renting to choose a place of my own. I found the house among the pines, with a studio full of skylights. It was not a glass case. It was a breathing, living space. I decided to throw a gathering, the kind I had always dreamed of. I sent invitations on heavy white linen cards, embossed with delicate florals, every envelope hand-addressed in rich gold ink. I mailed them to 35 people, friends from design school, clients, and mentors who had always seen me as more than just the eccentric Harrington child. Not a single card went to anyone in my family. The night of the gathering was flawless. Honey-colored wood floors gleamed under pendant lights. A long oak table sat beneath a canopy of linen. A duo played soft acoustic covers of Norah Jones. As plates clinked softly and laughter drifted into the garden, I realized I was hearing the sound of true belonging. Later that evening, my friend Zoe took a picture of me. I was standing barefoot on the porch. String lights wound loosely around my wrists like glowing bracelets. The next morning, she posted the picture online with a caption that lit a quiet fuse. She was never lost, just never allowed to lead. It read. I was sitting at my kitchen island when my phone began to vibrate against the marble counter. A low, continuous hum. It was dark in the room, save for the blue light of the screen illuminating the quiet shadows. Old classmates and professors were sending messages of pride, but nestled among them were the names that made my chest suddenly tighten. Mom, Claire, Marcus, Dad. The glass case was trying to close around me again. They hadn't been invited, but they saw everything. They saw the joy that couldn't be faked, the home built entirely without their permission. The first message came from Mom. The screen cast a pale light over my trembling fingers. She asked why I hadn't told them, noting that the house looked expensive. Then Claire, a sharp, guilt-laced message asking how I could plan a whole event and not think they might want to be there. Marcus tagged me in an old family photo, writing that some people forget their roots. And then my father. His message was the heaviest. It wasn't a long paragraph. It was a screenshot of Zoe's post with just one line typed beneath it. So this is who you are now. No question mark. Just a quiet, heavy accusation. I stared at the glowing words. The silence of my kitchen felt absolute. I could hear the wind moving through the pine branches outside. A soft, rushing sound like a deep exhale. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because, for once in my entire life, there was absolutely nothing to explain. They hadn't asked about my life in over a year. They hadn't called to wonder how I was building my world. But now that strangers were clapping for me, they wanted to claim me again. A few days later, the real confrontation arrived in my inbox. An email from my father. The subject line read, "Your choices." I remember the sound of the mouse clicking as I opened it, a tiny, sharp snap in the quiet room. The message was incredibly short. It was freezing cold. He wrote that they saw everything, that I had embarrassed the family, and that I acted like they didn't exist. He told me I should think before putting on a show, claiming that people were talking. At the same time, Claire posted a picture from a Harrington family dinner. She was smiling too tightly at their long table, captioning it with words about real love and real connection, something money couldn't buy. Zoe sent me a screenshot of Claire's post with one word attached to it, performative. I closed my laptop. I gently pushed it away across the wooden desk. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I realized, in that perfectly still moment, that it wasn't love driving their messages. It was control slipping away. They were scrambling to rewrite a narrative they had always owned, but they couldn't bend me anymore. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with unspoken ultimatums and fragile egos, but it was entirely on their side of the glass. I struck a match. The flame flared bright yellow in the dim room. I lit a candle along the garden wall, poured a glass of wine, and sat down. I posted one single, quiet line to my own story. Silence isn't distance. Sometimes it's healing. They all saw it, and this time, not a single one of them responded. The silence belonged to them now. Listen closely. Can you hear the soft, rhythmic clink of silver against ceramic? It is a small, everyday sound, but sometimes the smallest sounds hold the most weight. The message I didn't expect came just a few days after I drew that final, silent line in the sand. It was a simple text from Claire. I remember the bright glow of the screen illuminating the dark wood of my bedside table. The words were brief. Coffee. Just us. No performance. I stared at Claire's text for a very long time. The blue light reflected in my eyes. My first instinct was to ignore it completely. After all, this was the same sister who had laughed when my name was scribbled on a scrap of torn paper. The same woman who had brushed off years of our father's cruel dismissal as just his way. But there was something in the absolute simplicity of her message. There was no guilt, no performance, just an offer for coffee, and it made me pause. My fingers hovered over the glass. I replied with 3 deliberate words. Neutral place, no expectations. We met a week later. I chose a small cafe tucked quietly between a bookstore and a flower shop. It smelled of roasted espresso beans, old paper, and damp lily stems. It was the kind of spot that felt like an absolute sanctuary. She was already there when I walked in, her hands stirring a cappuccino. Her shoulders were drawn tight, pulled up toward her ears. I walked over. The wooden floorboards groaned gently under my boots. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I answered. I sat across from her, and for a long moment, silence sat incredibly heavy between us. But this time, it wasn't the suffocating silence of the glass case. It was the hesitant silence of an unmapped road. Claire was the first to break it. She kept her voice low, a fragile whisper over the rim of her cup. She'd admitted they had been awful, and she wouldn't defend it. She told me that seeing my party online and not being there felt like a slap. I raised an eyebrow, my voice steady and quiet. I told her I had been excluded my entire life, from jokes, from conversations, from mattering at all. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the warm wood of the table. I explained that the night wasn't about revenge, but about celebrating myself without apology, maybe for the very first time. She flinched slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping down to her coffee. Then she confessed the truth. She whispered that I had always scared them because I never fit into their blueprint. She said I felt unpredictable. I gave a quiet laugh. The sound vanished into the hum of the cafe. "You mean I didn't follow the family formula?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Something like that," she replied. Then her face grew very serious. She looked me in the eyes and asked what it would take for us to try again. I took a slow breath. I felt the air fill my lungs completely. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I told her she didn't get to rewrite me or poke fun and call it just teasing. I laid out the rules of my sanctuary. If she wanted to be in my life, she had to come in as an equal. No hierarchy, no performance, and absolutely no expectations of access. Claire blinked. She nodded slowly. She whispered that it was fair and asked if she could try to do better. I studied her face for a long moment. I told her she could try. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't closure, but it was undeniably real. For the very first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to shrink down to be heard. That realization changed the very air around me. 2 weeks later, an email arrived that felt almost like fate. The editorial team at a prestigious design publication wanted to do a full feature on women who build differently. My first reaction, born from years of conditioning, was to say no, to stay quiet and stay small. I remembered every heavy dinner table where I had swallowed my own voice to make my family comfortable. I remembered Dad's cold email, Marcus's smug laughter, and Mom's crushing indifference. And I thought no more. I said yes. The interview was deeply raw. I spoke honestly about leaving a life where I was treated as a footnote. I spoke about designing spaces not just for beauty, but for breath. I wanted to build for people who had always been told they were too much, or not enough. I didn't name any names, but I offered one clear truth. I said that sometimes the places we leave shape us just as much as the ones we build. When the article was published, it featured a photo of me barefoot in my studio. Sunlight was pouring through the glass skylight, and there were dark paint smudges across my fingertips. The caption read, Avery Harrington, 33, built her space the way she lives, deliberately and without asking for permission. The piece quietly went viral. Design clients reached out, and old professors sent notes of pride. Strangers messaged me to say my story helped them walk away from people who never clapped for them. And from my family? Silence. There were no more passive-aggressive posts. No more guilt-laced emails. Just the quiet, beautiful realization that they no longer held the center of my orbit. I had finally shed the heavy armor. The rain has finally stopped. Can you feel the shift in the room? The air feels lighter now. The heavy, protective blanket of the storm has lifted, leaving behind a crisp, absolute stillness. The candle on the table has burned all the way down to a small, glowing pool of wax. We are at the end of the long, dark corridor. That weekend, after the article went out into the world, I hosted another dinner. It was much smaller this time. There were no grand floral canopies or long, sweeping guest lists. It was just mentors, friends Zoe and Claire. Claire arrived with a simple, unpretentious bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of wine. The evening was incredibly soft. As we cleared the ceramic plates from the table that night, she lingered by my wooden bookshelf. I watched from the kitchen as she ran her fingers gently across the spines of the heavy art books. She turned to me, her voice barely a whisper in the warm room. She told me it was the first time she had ever seen me without armor. I smiled at her. I told her it was the first time I had ever felt safe enough to take it off. Later, after everyone had gathered their coats and drifted out into the night, the house settled into a profound, golden quiet. I opened the back doors and stepped into the garden barefoot. The damp stone walkway was cool against the soles of my feet. The string light swayed gently in the breeze above my head. The night air was crisp, carrying the soothing scent of lavender from the heavy terracotta pots I had placed nearby. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need any validation or headlines anymore. I just stood there, surrounded by the stillness, watching the candles flickering low. I realized with absolute clarity that I hadn't burned any bridges. I had simply built a better home. A home where I no longer had to beg for a seat at the table. Because this time, I made the table. The weeks that followed were incredibly steady, almost serene. My mornings always began the same way. Sunlight spilling through the skylight of my studio, a sketchbook open on the desk, and coffee cooling nearby. Work flowed from my hands in a way it never had before. I wasn't chasing anyone's approval anymore. I finally understood that I didn't need it. My family still hovered at the distant edges of my life. Occasionally, my phone would light up with a message from Mom, usually clipped and very cautious, hoping I was well. Marcus would post a pristine photo of his children at a piano recital, typing captions about tradition and legacy. But Claire kept showing up, not with grand, performative gestures, but with small, tentative ones. A short phone call on a quiet Tuesday evening, an invitation to meet at an art gallery, sometimes just a simple text saying she was thinking of me. She simply tried, and that was enough for now. And Dad? He never reached out again. His silence was absolute, but the miracle was that it no longer gnawed at me. His approval used to feel like oxygen being withheld until I gasped for air. Now I breathed completely without it. I traveled to Vancouver to speak at that design conference. I stood on a bright stage, looking out at rows of faces. I saw women who had also been told their passions were just cute, or not serious. I felt the last remnants of my old shame dissolve completely. I told them that silence is a revolution. It is the quiet act of refusing to shrink. The applause that followed wasn't chaotic. It was steady, like a strong, healthy heartbeat. Close your eyes now. Take one final, deep breath with me. We spend so much of our lives begging for seats at tables built by other people, just waiting for someone to scoot over and make a tiny bit of space. But the most radical thing you can ever do is build your own. You must invite those who see you not as a project to be fixed, but as an equal to be celebrated. Love is never measured in polite applause or titles. It is measured in presence and respect. I hadn't been lost all those years in that glass house. I had been planting tiny seeds in the dark, in complete silence, just waiting for a garden where I could finally bloom. And now I am standing in it, barefoot, unarmored, fully myself.